Magnus the Red has stood in the ashes of Prospero and watched 30,000 space wolves disembark across the ruins of the city his legion called home. He has felt the webway project collapse because of a message he sent with his own hands. He has spent 10,000 years since then counting the costs of his existence, adding each one to a ledger he can't stop reviewing. That ledger has a gap in it. Magnus doesn't know the gap is there. Not the burning of Prospero, not the shattered webway. Somewhere earlier, in the years between 927 and 964 of the 30th millennium, a narrow window in the Great Crusade's final decades, something was done through Magnus, or by him, or with him as the instrument, and was then removed from his memory so completely that he never thought to look for the scar. What happened in that window is what this argument is about. The default account of the lost Primarchs is that two sons of the Emperor committed crimes severe enough to justify the most thorough obliteration in imperial history. Not just execution, not just expulsion, but the complete erasure of their names, records, legacies, and eventually the memories of everyone who had known them. The received wisdom is that they failed, or rebelled, or fell in some way that earned this. The Imperium removed them and moved on. That account has a problem, several of them. They show up in the same places across the Heresy novel series, in the same emotional register, and they don't match what administrative closure looks like in those texts. They match grief. This channel's previous Lost Primarch video built the case for what 11 may have been biologically, and where his body likely ended up during the siege. This video is a different argument, not what 11 was, why he was removed, who did it, and why that act is almost certainly the first move in a game that everyone thereafter called the Horus Heresy. The 11th Primarch was created in a secret underground laboratory on Terra from genetic material drawn from two sources, the Emperor of Mankind and a Perpetual named Erda. Dan Abnett confirms this in Saturnine, Part 2, Chapter 3. That dual lineage matters. The Emperor didn't build all 20 Primarchs with a Perpetual co-contributor. This one was different, constructed with a deliberateness that operates at a level of genetic and psychic engineering the canon says exceeds anything mortal science could replicate. The Emperor knew what he was building and chose to build it this way. Like all the Primarchs, 11 was scattered in infancy through the warp in 792 M30 and deposited on a human-inhabited world. He was the 19th of 20 to be found, located in 927 M30, second to last, ahead only of Alfarius, who wasn't found until 981. That discovery order matters. 11 had the shortest active operational period of any Primarch who actually commanded his legion. Discovered in 927, fate sealed before 964 M30, at most 37 years of Great Crusade service between his rediscovery and his expungement. In Aaron Dembski-Bowden's The First Heretic, the word-bearer Argel Tal and his brothers experience a shared warp vision called the Gal Vorbak Revelation. They walk through the gestation chamber where the Primarchs were created, among the tanks, until they reach tank 11. Zaphon looks at the infant within and remarks that the 11th Primarch is still innocent and pure. This is before the scattering, before the worlds they landed on, before whatever came after. Argel Tal's response is that killing 11 at that moment, before birth, before the fate that came later, would unwrite a shameful future. Innocent and pure before the scattering, a future that retrospectively deserved to be unwritten. Those two observations belong to different stories, and the first heretic never reconciles them into one. In the same novel, Magnus and Lorgar discuss the lost brothers 43 years before the drop site massacre.
Lorgar has just survived the demolition of Monarchia and is calculating what the Emperor might do to the word-bearers next. He tells Magnus, "We would be cast alongside the brothers we no longer speak of." Magnus confirms it. He also confirms, per the First Heretic, Chapter 10, that the surviving Primarchs swore an oath after Eleven's removal not to discuss the lost ones at all, not to mourn them publicly, not to name their crimes, to seal the whole subject the way you seal a contaminated room. When an oath of silence is the mechanism for processing a loss, it usually means the loss is too painful to examine directly. In Graham McNeil's 1,000 Sons, during the triumph of Ulanor, Magnus opens a sentence he can't finish. 9 sons of the Emperor gathered together on one world. Such a thing hasn't happened since... Mortarion stops him immediately. I know well when it was. And the Emperor forbade us to speak of it again. Do you disobey that command? The last time 10 or more sons shared the same world, 11 and his brother 2 were still present. That gathering isn't discussed, not analyzed, locked behind a command from the Emperor that carries enough weight to silence even Magnus, at least for a moment. In the short story The Last Council, Horus, Jagatai Khan, and Alpharius enter the Council of Terra without announcement, clearly furious. A statue of one of the lost Primarchs has been ordered removed from the Investiary, the chamber of all 20 Primarch monuments in the Imperial Palace, and Horus won't accept this without a fight. He argues, per the story's text, that this brother brought glory to the Imperium. Malcador firmly disagrees. When Horus moves to speak the Primarch's name out loud, Malcador psychically chokes him mid-syllable. Horus, the War Master, the most formidable warrior alive at that moment, stops involuntarily. The phonetics that escape before his throat closes. That is the most complete fragment of Eleven's name the Black Library has ever committed to text. A partial sound from a man being forcibly stopped from saying it by the most powerful human psyker alive outside the Emperor himself. Whatever name began with those syllables, Malcador believed it couldn't be spoken aloud during the Siege of Terra. In James Swallow's short story, Lost Sons, a reference is made to a black scroll being delivered to Baal when the Blood Angels are presumed missing. The narrator notes it's the 3rd time in living memory such a message has been delivered to a legion's homeworld. 2 prior deliveries. 2 prior legions declared excommunicate traitoris. 11 and 2 each had a homeworld. Each received that scroll. In Dan Abnett's The Chamber at the End of Memory, during preparations for the Siege of Terra, Rogel Dorn is walking the corridors of the Imperial Palace when his team uncovers chambers apparently shifted from their previous position. The personal chambers of the 2nd and 11th Primarchs, sealed behind a door bearing the old-style mark of 11, described in the text as a steel portico. Dorn and Malcador discuss it briefly. Dorn's resolution: bury it. His words in the text: just a tomb that should be forgotten, not a crime scene, not a closed case, a tomb. When Dorn presses Malcador on what 11's loss meant, Malcador's answer ends the conversation in 3 words: they are lost to us forever. One more text, and this one operates differently from the others. Graham McNeil's The Outcast Dead, Book 17 of the Horus Heresy, is set approximately 2 years after Magnus's psychic breach of the Emperor's webway wards. The character Evander Grigoris, the master of the Cryptesthesians, says of the incoming Space Wolves' response to Magnus's transgression, "It will mean the wolves will be loosed again." That word, again. An executioner force doesn't have an again unless they have been deployed for exactly this purpose before. Grigoris isn't inventing the category. He is identifying that what Magnus triggered belongs to an established pattern of Space Wolf sanction action.
The wolves have done this before. What the previous sanction was protecting and what it was hiding is the architecture the texts gesture toward without completing. How the canon describes the loss of Subject 11 does not match the emotional signature of a purge the Emperor resolved and moved past. In Gav Thorpe's Deliverance Lost, Corvus Corax is reunited with the Emperor on Lycaeus in 922 M30. He is the 19th Primarch and knows his own number, but when he tries to count his brothers, he finds the gap. He asks. The Emperor's response is immediate and physical. His face grows bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He says it's a conversation for another day. An administrator who removed a problem asset does not respond to a reference to that removal with uninvited, visible grief. The Emperor, as Aaron Dembski-Bowden characterizes him across The Master of Mankind, is someone who does not display what he does not have to display. When sorrow breaks the surface in Deliverance Lost, it breaks uninvited. In Nick Kime's Vulcan Lives, Vulcan tells his equerry Artellus Numion during a moment on Keraton that none of them wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the investiary, another brother's name excised from all record. Then the exact words, "It's shame enough to bear the grief for two." Grief, used without qualification, without irony. Not relief that a problem was solved, not acknowledgement that justice was served. Grief for two. In James Swallow's Fear to Tread, Sanguinius refuses to tell the Emperor about the red thirst because he fears becoming what he calls a third empty plinth. The specific fear Sanguinius is working through isn't that he will fall to chaos. It's that the Emperor will look at the Blood Angel's flaw and decide removal is the cleaner option. The lost Primarchs function in his mind not as justified cases, but as cautionary examples of how the calculus runs, and notably, the calculus he fears isn't moral. It's operational. The Emperor removes sons who become unmanageable problems. Sanguinius wants to solve the problem himself before the Emperor sees it. In Dan Abnett's short story, The Lightning Tower, Rogel Dorn walks through the falls of the Kathmandu precinct of the Imperial Palace and finds the row of plinths holding statues of all 20 Primarchs. 2 are empty. His thought in the text. Their separate tragedies had seemed like aberrations. Had they, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded? Separate tragedies. Dorn distinguishes the two fates, not the same incident, not the same cause. And tragedies, which is a word that does not apply to justified punishment. The chamber at the end of memory states directly that 11's loss threatened the core ideals of the Great Crusade and might have ruined the burgeoning Imperium. That phrasing describes the impact of his removal, not the impact of his presence. His absence from the crusade threatened the ideals. His being there would have sustained them. That is the inverse of how you would describe the removal of a traitor. His legionaries were spared and redistributed. Guilliman and Dorn argued for them, and their argument succeeded. Per the chamber at the end of memory, whatever fate befell 11 left his legion leaderless and forsaken, but didn't touch the men themselves. If 11's crime had involved genuine treachery, a full turn against the Emperor, chaos corruption of the legion's soul, the legionaries wouldn't have been protected. The failure, the text implies, resided in the Primarch alone, and possibly not entirely there. Magnus the Red's warp capabilities in the pre-heresy period are documented extensively in 1,000 Suns, and what they establish is important.
McNeill confirms in that novel that Magnus was in psychic communication with the Emperor while still in gestation, before the scattering, before Prospero, before any formal development. His psychic signature was present and active before he existed in any conventional sense. When he arrived on Prospero as an infant, the scholars who received him recognized something extraordinary. His capsule landed in the central plaza of Tisca, the City of Light. By the time of his rediscovery by the emperor in 840 M30, Magnus had already spent decades conducting what McNeill describes as long and far-reaching psychic journeys into the furthest reaches of the warp. He had mastered every psychic training program available to Prospero's scholars. He had forced entry into the Eldar webway, a structure requiring either perfect geometric knowledge of its access points or raw psychic force of an order almost no being alive could generate. He achieved it by brute force. The flesh change crisis, where Magnus's legion began to suffer catastrophic degenerative mutations, is the moment 1,000 Suns establishes as Tzeentch's first formal move. McNeill is explicit. Magnus was unknowingly fooled by the Chaos God into believing he had bested the warp entities offering him a cure. He thought he won the negotiation. He hadn't. The arrangement locked the 1,000 Suns' genetic instability temporarily while tightening Tzeentch's hold on Magnus's psychic operating principles. Every time Magnus used his gifts after that deal, he used them on terms pre-negotiated without his knowledge. This is the structural mechanic of every Tzeentch manipulation in the canon. The target believes they are choosing freely. They are choosing, but from options Tzeentch arranged. The Book of Tzeentch states it without ambiguity. I am Tzeentch, and you are the puppet that dances to my tune. The dance is convincing because the puppet believes it's improvising. Tzeentch's canonical lore describes his method as threading the ensnared soul of a human puppet at the end of each scheme, a puppet who believes they serve in a mutually beneficial arrangement. That description maps precisely onto Magnus's relationship with the entity from its very first documented contact. This deal precedes the Great Crusade's resumption for the 1,000 Suns by years. It precedes Nicaea by decades. Tzeentch had Magnus as a managed asset before the Emperor and Magnus had been working together for a generation. The canonical record of Magnus's warp projections over long distances includes 2 documented instances. In 1,000 Suns, he launches his soul through the warp to find Horus inside his chaos fever dream and observe what has happened to the War Master. Later, more famously, he burns his consciousness across the galaxy from Prospero to Terra, crashing through the Emperor's webway wards in the warning attempt that precedes the burning. Both feats happen after decades of additional development, after Nicaea, after the heresy has already started. In the 930s and 940s of M30, the window of 11's fate, Magnus was younger, but the capability was already present. The flesh change deal, which precedes those years, confirms Tzeentch had been shaping that capability for his own purposes long before anyone else was paying attention. And the Outcast Dead confirms, through Gregorus's single line 2 years after the webway breach, that the pattern of Space Wolf-sanctioned action against legions has a precedent. The wolves were loosed before. The question Gregorus's word again opens isn't whether 11's removal happened. The question is how. Chris Wright's Path of Heaven isn't a novel about the lost Primarchs, but it operates against a backdrop that illuminates this reading from an unexpected angle: the role of Perpetuals in the Emperor's longer planning horizon.
A perpetual, in the canonical mechanics established across the Heresy series, carries their soul identity intact across death. The same spirit, the same consciousness, reconstituted in a new body. The Emperor himself is a perpetual of ancient standing. Vulcan is the best documented Primarch with this trait.
Rate's novel engages with this framework during the middle of the heresy, when the Emperor's long game is increasingly the only game left. What that context does for this argument is illuminate the Saturnine detail. 11 was created from the genetic material of both the Emperor and the perpetual Erda. The Emperor didn't take that step with every Primarch. This one was built differently at a foundational level, with deliberate choices made at the genetic and psychic engineering layer. Whether that translated into any specific functional longevity beyond normal Primarch physiology, the canon doesn't establish clearly. But the Emperor wasn't building his sons casually. He was designing forces intended to operate against entities that think in millennia. Tzeentch plans on those same timescales. His canonical lore describes schemes that span eons and fruitions that cost reality itself. A Primarch designed with a Perpetual's genetic inheritance, built for a longer operational horizon than a single campaign cycle, is specifically the kind of chess piece that becomes a structural problem when the board is being set up for a game that won't conclude for centuries. Remove that piece before the game begins and you never have to account for it in the endgame. Now to the part of this argument where evidence thins and inference begins, and both deserve honest labels. What the texts confirm. Subject 11 was removed in the 37-year window from 927 to 964 M30. His loss threatened the Great Crusade's core ideals. His failure almost certainly didn't involve chaos corruption. The first heretic establishes that Lorgar discovered the nature of chaos only after the lost Primarchs were already expunged, and the surviving Primarchs continued to distinguish the lost brothers from their traitor counterparts without mentioning chaos taint. Malcador erased the memories of the lost Primarchs from the other Primarchs at their own request. The canon confirms this. Magnus, in that same period, was the most warp-capable individual alive outside the Emperor, already operating as a managed asset under terms Tzeentch had set without his knowledge, conducting psychic forays that no other Primarch could monitor or replicate. What the texts permit but don't confirm, that Tzeentch directed Magnus, through the same mechanics of manipulation already established as canonical, belief in a mutually beneficial arrangement, actions taken without understanding their purpose, to find 11 during a pre-heresy warp foray and remove him. Then, consistent with Tzeentch's documented method of operating through unwitting instruments, took the memory of that act from Magnus before he could process what it had been. The case rests on capability, timeline, and one phonetic trace. The trace is the syllables from the Last Council, Mao, Ao, which is the only fragment of 11's name the canon has produced, choking out of the most powerful Primarch alive at the moment Malcador chose to prevent it. What that name refers to is where the inference lives. There is also the Malal connection, which requires its own careful handling. In the 1990 publication, Realm of Chaos, The Lost and the Damned, Games Workshop introduced a renegade chaos entity called Malal, a fifth power who embodied chaos's self-destructive tendency, hostile to the other four gods, subsequently removed from canon through a copyright dispute. The specific claim that Malal's sacred number is 11 can't be confirmed from available primary source text. Tzeentch's canonical sacred number is 9, not 11.
The phonetics that escape Horus's throat begin with Mao, which some readers align with Malal's name, and Malal's nature as the chaos god whom the other chaos gods would want expunged from existence has an obvious resonance with a Primarch whose very existence needed to be erased. That alignment is thematic resonance,
not proof. Worth noting, then setting down. What isn't uncertain is this. Horus knew 11's name. Malcador couldn't allow it said. Whatever 11 was called, it carried enough weight in 000M31 that its utterance during the Siege of Terra was something the Sigillite used psychic force to prevent. The Horus heresy required, at its architecture, the vulnerability of individual primarchs. Erebus worked on Horus for years before the Davin wound. The word-bearers built their ideological framework over decades. Each primarch who fell had a specific psychological crack that was found and exploited. Horus's fear of obsolescence and mortality, Magnus's hunger for knowledge and contempt for prohibition, Lorgar's desperate need for something transcendent to worship, Fulgrim's vanity, Angron's pain. The Chaos Gods are documented across the Heresy series as operating through those individual wounds. They don't convert primarchs through superior firepower. They find the place where a primarch's nature makes him reachable and press there. A primarch without that kind of crack isn't just a strong fighter for the loyalist side. He is a structural obstacle to the entire project. Horus's conversion succeeded partly because other primarchs weren't in the right position at the right moment, because the galaxy is large and the forces are dispersed. But a primarch whose loyalty to the Emperor is architectural, not conditional, loyalty that doesn't pass through pride, grief, or ambition because those filters don't apply to it, is a presence that changes the mathematical assumptions of the heresy entirely. The chamber at the end of memory notes that 11's legion's loyalty to the Emperor had allegedly been manipulated by 11 toward ill ends, drawing the ire of the space wolves. That word, allegedly, is doing significant work. The record of 11 that survives passed through Malcador's filtration, through the expungement process, through an oath of silence sworn by the surviving primarchs. What 11 allegedly did with his legion's loyalty is the surviving fragment of a justification for what was done to him. The tragic inversion that the texts most strongly support is this. 11's crime may have been pushing his legion's loyalty past the point where the imperial command structure could manage it comfortably. Absolute loyalty. Loyalty that bypasses intermediate authority and goes directly to the Emperor and the ideal the Crusade was supposed to represent, isn't treachery by any conventional definition. But from the perspective of an entity designing a heresy that required Space Marine legions to redirect their obedience from the Emperor toward Primarch figures, toward War Master figures, toward the promises that chaos could make once the Emperor was sufficiently distant. From Tzeentch's perspective, a Primarch who could short-circuit that entire architecture by existing is an existential obstacle. The heresy's psychological infrastructure required Primarchs to be reachable through their individual wounds. A Primarch who couldn't be reached through those channels, who would stand in an assembly and say no and be believed by his legion, and perhaps by others because his loyalty was visibly unconditional, isn't merely a military problem. He is a persuasive argument against defection that walks the halls of the Great Crusade, making that case every day by existing. Remove him early enough, quietly enough, and the remaining Primarchs carry the grief of his loss without understanding its cause.
Grief without an object, without an explanation, tends to calcify into exactly the kind of ambient sorrow that makes the later promises of chaos more compelling. Purpose, significance, something to fight for that the Emperor apparently couldn't or wouldn't provide. Lehman Russ confirms in Prospero Burns that Astartes fighting Astartes wasn't unprecedented for his legion. A Space Wolves fleet action against a recently discovered,
innocent and pure Primarch commanding a loyal legion, leaves records, though. It leaves trauma in the other Primarchs, who would demand to understand what happened. It leaves a visible wound in the Great Crusade's narrative that requires explanation. What 11's removal left behind was different. Not a wound, but an absence so total that the surviving Primarchs asked to have their own memories taken. That isn't what fleet engagements produce. Magnus, in that window, was the only available instrument precise enough to produce an absence rather than a wound. The canonical heresy timeline begins at Davin, where Horus was wounded by Eugen Temba and then corrupted in a chaos ritual that returned him to health by opening him to the ruinous powers. That event is the conventional first entry on every heresy timeline. In Graham McNeil's False Gods, the vision Horus experiences inside the Davinite temple takes him to the Genovault where the Primarchs were created. He walks among the tanks. He stops before Tank 11. McNeil writes that Horus reflected upon the untapped glories within, knowing they would never come to pass. Then his anger surfaces, and he smashes his fist into the tank. McNeil notes the truth of this vision is unclear. It was orchestrated by chaos, showing Horus what the chaos gods wanted him to see. The question worth holding is what they wanted him to see. Not Horus's own tank, not the Primarchs who would stand with him. Tank 11 and the untapped glories that would never come to pass. The chaos gods chose to show Horus a Primarch already gone, already unwritten, already a hole in the pattern where something significant had been. And they arranged for Horus to damage the tank himself. 11 was found in 927 M30. His fate was sealed before 964 M30. The Davin wounding happens after Nicaea, after the word-bearers were rebuked at Monarchia in 964 M30. Meaning the first canonical heresy moment falls in the late 960s or 970s of M30 at the earliest. Subject 11 was removed decades before the heresy's nominal first act. Every major canonical heresy trigger, Davin, Istvan, Prospero, the siege itself, postdates his disappearance by decades or centuries. If the reading this argument builds holds, then the heresy's first murder happened before the heresy's nominal beginning. Not by a traitor Primarch, not by a loyalist who fell to ambition, but through the most capable warp-traversing instrument available, on behalf of a plan whose author never announces his moves, against a target whose loyalty made the entire subsequent project structurally impossible without his removal. Davin, Istvan, Prospero. These are consequences, not causes. The cause was a window in late M30, 37 years wide, where the most loyal son was removed and the most loyal instrument was used to do it without knowing. Magnus stood at Prospero while it burned. He had sent his soul through the warp to warn the Emperor about Horus's betrayal. The act that destroyed the Webway project, the act that brought Leman Russ and the Space Wolves, the act that shattered his legion across the Eye of Terror. Magnus did all of that in love. He was trying to save the Imperium. He broke it instead. Graham McNeil built the entirety of 1,000 Suns on that exact architecture. The loyal act that destroys what it was trying to protect. The man who is always the last to understand the consequences of what he has done.
If the hour in the warp happened the way this argument infers, then Prospero wasn't the first time that shape played out. The flesh change deal was, in 1,000 Suns' own words, a ruse. Magnus entered that arrangement believing he had outwitted the entity on the other side. He hadn't. Tzeentch set the terms of the deal and ensured that whatever Magnus did with his psychic gifts afterward would serve Tzeentch's purposes,
with Magnus unaware that this was the outcome. The willing instrument who never knows he is an instrument. That is the documented model. Not a command, not a visible instruction. A path that Magnus chose freely, that Tzeentch arranged for him to choose, leading to an outcome Tzeentch needed without Magnus understanding what he had done. If that model was applied earlier, in the 930s or 940s of M30, in a warp foray that no one else could follow or verify, then Tzeentch required only one additional step for the murder to remain hidden. The memory of the hour had to be taken before Magnus could examine it. The archive had to be cleared before he could read it. Magnus went to his damnation at Prospero believing the warning he sent in love was his greatest sin. He has carried that weight across 10,000 years. What the texts permit, at the edge of inference, is that the first sin was already gone before he had a chance to know he'd committed it. Tzeentch gave him a different crime to carry in its place, enormous, visible, crushing, one that would define him for eternity and point his grief in exactly the direction it needed to go. The Emperor knew what had happened to Subject 11. The face that went bleak, filled with deep sorrow, in Deliverance Lost. That happened in 922 M30, years after 11's removal, and the sorrow was still right at the surface. The Emperor does not grieve his administrative decisions. He grieves his losses. What he couldn't do was undo it. What he didn't do was tell Magnus. Telling Magnus would mean telling him what Tzeentch had made him. Whether the Emperor couldn't face that conversation, or calculated that Magnus couldn't survive knowing it, or judged that the heresy was already in motion and there was nothing the truth would save, the texts don't resolve it. What they confirm is the silence. The Emperor carried what he knew alone. Magnus went to Prospero. The heresy took its course. The first sin remained unspoken between them across the full length of the catastrophe that followed. Malcador erased the memories of the lost Primarchs from the surviving brothers at their own request. That is confirmed canon. He carried the weight of those two numbered skulls through the entire siege. The surviving brothers chose to forget. Magnus never needed to choose. His was already gone. Rogel Dorn found the steel portico of 11's chamber during the siege and decided to bury it. Just a tomb that should be forgotten. The record that survives, assembled from The First Heretic, 1,000 Suns, Deliverance Lost, Vulcan Lives, Fear to Tread, The Lightning Tower, The Outcast Dead, The Last Council, and The Chamber at the End of Memory, points towards something the official account can't contain. An innocent Primarch, found late, lost quickly. A sorcerer who could reach anywhere in the warp and was already running on someone else's leash. A god who plans in eons and does not announce his moves. The heresy didn't begin with Horus's wound at Davin. It began with an absence that the surviving Primarchs would spend the rest of the Great Crusade grieving without knowing why. A hole in the assembly carved out before the heresy had a name, by the most capable instrument available, for the benefit of a plan that wouldn't reveal its full shape for another century. Horus didn't start the heresy. Magnus did. He just doesn't remember. The Emperor knew. The Emperor never told him. That is the heresy's first cruelty, and the last.
If you want the foundation of this argument, what she may have been biologically, the dark vaults under the palace, the null Primarch reading, that's the previous video on this channel. Subscribe for more stories like this.